Welcome everybody to the Alum Fellows Reading Series, where former fellows read and discuss their recent work. Today we're excited to have Christa Clarke join us, and she'll be introduced by Nikki Greene, also an alum fellow, who is professor of art at Wellesley College. Her new book, forthcoming from Duke, is Grime, Glitter, and Glass, the Body and the Sonic in Contemporary Black Art. Take it over, Nikki.
Thank you, Krishna. It's good to be back home at the Hutchins Center, and I'm thrilled to introduce Christa Clarke and to be in conversation with her. Christa Clarke is an independent curator, art historian, and an affiliate of Harvard's Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. Previously, she was a senior curator, Arts of Global Art Africa at the Newark Museum of Art, where she organized exhibitions on topics ranging from men's fashion to Nigerian modernism, and established Newark's significant collection of modern and contemporary African art, including major commissions by Yinka Shonibare CBE that you'll hear about today, Simone Lee, and Odili Odita. Christa has been a fellow at the Smithsonian, Metropolitan Museum of Art, Harvard University, and the Clarke Art Institute. She also taught at NYU, Abu Dhabi, University of Pennsylvania, George Washington University, Drew University, and Rutgers. Her publications include Representing Africa in American Art Museums, published in 2010, and African Art at the Barnes Foundation in 2015. For which she received the David C. Driscoll and the James A. Porter Book Award for African American History, and first prize for excellence from the Association of Art Museum Curators. A 2012 fellow at the Center for Curatorial Leadership, Christa is committed to advancing equity in museums, which she has furthered through her longtime involvement with the Association of Art Museums Curators, most recently serving as its president from 2017 to 2019, and now trustee emerita. She's currently completing a book, The Activist Collector, an African-American woman in pre-apartheid South Africa, which is another Newark resident story. And her name was Lita Clanton Broner. And during her extraordinary 9-month journey, she collected such wonderful works, and its expeditionary afterlives in the US is what Christa will be documenting. So without further ado, I introduce to you Christa Clarke.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Thank you for agreeing to join me in discussion today. And thanks also to the Hutchins Center. Feels like coming home for me as well. I'm very grateful to have an affiliation. Today, I'm going to be reading from a forthcoming essay in an edited volume called Revisiting the Past in Museums and Historic Sites, which we publish next year by Routledge. And my essay is titled The Gilded Age Revisited, Yinka Shonabari CBE at the Newark Museum of Art. And it offers an account of the conceptual development of this installation from my perspective as the commissioning curator in 2009. So I have some images here. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, I'll be reading 4 passages, and then Nikki and I will have a dialogue. So, visitors stepping into the Newark Museum's Victorian-era Ballantine House during the summer of 2009 were undoubtedly surprised to see its stately dining room completely transformed. In the opulent mahogany-paneled space, a spirited late 19th century dinner party had sprung to life. 8 life-size mannequins in fashionable period dress gather around an elaborately set table. From the corner, another figure, the butler, steps forward, bearing a dramatic main course, a peacock with a gilded beak served on a silver platter. The revelry is suspended in time, a glass of wine perpetually in mid-spill, the remains of quail eggs and shucked oysters casually discarded well into a decadent multi-course feast. Overly animated body language suggests that proper Victorian etiquette has been cast aside as an indulgent celebration of prosperity tips toward debauchery. A fantastical, almost surreal quality suffuses this late 19th century tableau vivant. The caramel-colored figures are headless, rendering their identity ambiguous, and their feasting entirely impossible. And the use of vibrantly colored African print textiles throughout for the European-style dress of the figures, the upholstery of the chairs, and even the elaborate floral centerpieces adds a seemingly incongruous element that heightens the sense of cultural displacement in this colorful period drama. Party Time Reimagine America is a site-responsive installation by the British-Nigerian artist Yinka Shonibare, CBE, originally commissioned in honor of the 100th anniversary of the Newark Museum in 2009. Shonabari is well known for his subversive, often humorous explorations of race, gender, and social class in a range of media, including sculpture, painting, photography, and film. Although he has long addressed the intertwined histories of the West and Africa, especially those of the Victorian era, Party Time was his first work created for an actual period environment and is an early example of the recent trend of artistic interventions in historic homes. It was presented as a temporary exhibition in the Ballantine House in 2009 and subsequently acquired by the museum, which has since shown the work in the same space in 2013 and 2017. Within this period setting, the artist has conjured a formal dinner party in the time of Jeanette and John Ballantine, the prominent Newark brewing family for whom the house was originally built in 1885. The installation takes as its point of departure the quest for refinement that accompanied industrialization in the United States, when the elaborate dinner party began to replace the humble repast, becoming a celebratory occasion for the white ruling class. The mise-en-scène invites us to consider the discrepancy of wealth generated by turn-of-the-century enterprise within a global framework, probing the relationship between luxury and labor. Playful yet pointed, Shonabari's reimagining casts a new light on America's Gilded Age, complicating and challenging dominant narratives about race, class, and cultural authority. The next passage I'll read is from a section that introduces the history of the Ballantine House, which was purchased by the museum in the 30s, and from the mid-1970s featured period rooms that showcased the decorative arts collection until a 1989 restoration project, which led to a major reinstallation, which I discuss here. Underlying the museum's desire to reinstall and reinterpret the Ballantine House in 1994 was a comment by a local school teacher who saw no reason to bring her, quote, mostly poor, mostly minority students into a grand house that was built for long dead, rich white people, end quote. In addressing this challenge to its relevance, Newark adopted a team approach led by decorative arts curator Ulysses Dietz, and consisting of in-house education and exhibition design staff, as well as outside interpretive, curatorial, and design consultants. Visitor feedback gleaned from a series of focus groups representing the museum's diverse audiences ultimately guided the final result, House and Home, which opened in 1994. This conceptually progressive reinterpretation eschewed the more traditional approach of historic house museums, which typically use decorative arts collections to teach about style and design in favor of considering how objects embody cultural values related to the idea of an ideal home. Most significantly, the Newark Museum team identified their target audience as non-white visitors in their 30s and 40s, both urban and suburban, who visited the museum with children. Though the installation was intended to appeal to the broadest possible audience, this was a specific group of visitors that the museum sought to connect with and offer a positive educational experience. Toward that end, the museum adopted a number of interpretive strategies that shifted from a sole focus on the wealthy Ballantines and their lifestyle to include a broader range of perspectives, suggesting a considerably more complex social landscape. Indeed, late 19th century Newark was a mix of diverse ethnic and racial groups, including a large number of European immigrants and a small but growing African-American population. The museum also revised its institutional collecting policy for decorative arts to focus attention on acquiring household objects that had a history of ownership more reflective of these diverse communities. In parallel fashion, a series of storybook panels in each of the 9 rooms introduced dialogues between historical or historically plausible characters, with the aim of revealing broader social realities and prevailing cultural attitudes of a particular moment in time, which was defined as 1891. The panels introduced an African-American couple, James and Pauline Baxter, waiting to be received by Jeanette Ballantyne in the reception room. Though the scenario is invented, the Baxters were in fact real people. James Baxter was an influential educator who served for 45 years, beginning in 1864, as the first Black principal of Newark's Colored School, where his wife was a teacher. The storybook imagines the Baxters paying a formal visit to the Ballantynes' house to solicit a donation for their church's missionary work, where they would have been cordially welcomed by Mrs. Ballantyne in the reception room, but not permitted to go farther. The interpretive goal here was to give both visibility to the historical presence of middle-class Blacks in 19th century Newark, while also underscoring the reality of their marginalized status in that era. If envisioning the Baxters stepping into the Ballantyne house opened the door, literally and figuratively, to a revisionist understanding of the period environment, Yinka Shonabari's Party Time aimed to disrupt history in a 21st century reimagining that takes poetic license with the past. Quote, history itself, we know, is very subjective anyway, Shonabari has observed. And history is always written from the point of view of people with power. And that then is brought forward as the authentic point of view. Then what happens to people who are being subjected to that kind of lie, as it were, or that fallacy, he asks. In Party Time, Shonabari effectively asks, what would it have been like if the Baxters or other non-whites in Newark had been allowed in past the front parlor? I'll now read from a section about how Newark's history informed Shonabari's conceptualization. At the time of the museum's founding in 1909, 2/3 of Newark's demographic were foreign-born, largely from Italy, Germany, and Ireland. More recent immigrants hail from places as far-flung as Brazil, the Dominican Republic, Ghana, and Portugal. While acknowledging this cultural complexity, Shonabari was particularly interested in the history of African Americans in Newark, whose presence in the city dates to at least the 18th century. Their trajectory was, of course, different than the immigrant groups in that they did not come to the United States voluntarily, but arrived as enslaved individuals. And while New Jersey has also been a place where many Southern Blacks settled beginning in the 19th century, the state has often itself been likened to the South in terms of its treatment of African Americans. American historian Giles Wright has drawn attention to this contrast, characterizing New Jersey as a place of, quote, hostility and hardship necessitating struggle, and yet a place of succor and opportunity permitting achievement, end quote. The history of African Americans in New Jersey and the city of Newark's prominent role in racial justice movements informed the conceptualization of Party Time. Shonabari's proposal for the commission began by calling attention to the fact that New Jersey was actually the northern state most resistant to abolishing slavery and was also slow to pass the 13th Amendment, which didn't happen until January 1866. He highlighted Newark's long struggle for civil rights, culminating in the uprisings in July of 1967, which, the artist pointedly observed, civil rights leaders referred to as a rebellion or a struggle for place, as opposed to its popular characterization as a riot. Shonabari located the roots of this struggle in the early 19th century, as the demand for workers in an increasingly industrializing city drew emancipated Blacks north in search of work. Despite this historic presence, Shonabari further described what he has characterized as the persistent civic invisibility of African Americans, who were routinely left out of official records and historic accounts. In turn, Shonabari noted, Black dissidents, quote, constructed and sustained systems of expression such as newspapers, secret societies, and fraternal associations to counter white hostility and to carve a place for themselves within their contemporary framework, end quote. It was not till the 1960s, when people of color became Newark's majority population, that the mentality of non-white as outsider espoused by systems of establishment began to change, along with an evolving social and political representation. The outsider is a recurring theme in Shonabari's work, but for the artist, the outsider is in fact always already within. His photographic suite, Diary of a Victorian Dandy, offers an early example, one that might also be seen as a conceptual precedent for party time. Playing the role of the dandy himself, the artist was a protagonist in a 3-day performance featuring a cast of professional actors in period dress and taking place in a stately home in the English countryside. The resulting work is a series of theatrical photographs tracking the day and the life of a frivolous and pretentious character who revels in pleasure and excess throughout the course of the day, attended to by servants and fawned over by admirers, all of whom are white. As the principal actor in this late 19th century melodrama, Shonibare positions himself within the dominant culture in a history from which he has been erased, claiming both space and agency and insisting on his visibility. British Jamaican cultural theorist Stuart Hall has framed this kind of reimagining of history as a, quote, unsettling of heritage, a rewriting of the outside into the inside. Critically, he notes, quote, this is not so much a matter of representing us as of representing more adequately, them. The degree to what their history entails and has always implicated us across history and vice versa. These interwoven histories are at the very core of Shonibari's identity. As the artist has said, explaining why the Victorian era is an important point of reference in his work, I am an African speaking English to you. The reason for that is because of the colonial period, empire building, and the British encounter with Africa, end quote. In his artistic practice, Shonibare affirms such global entanglements, both their historic presence and present inflections. The Ballantine House offered the artist a distinctive and new type of space, the period room, and a specifically American context in which he could unsettle history. And now I'll conclude with a final section, which looks at the commission closely. A closer look at the African print or Dutch wax fabric that Shonibare cleverly deploys uncovers layers of meaning, disclosing what British art historian Kobina Mercer calls their hidden history of interculturation. Shonibare has embraced these eye-catching fabrics because, as he puts it, they refuse stereotypes. They signify Africanness, but were first created in the 19th century by the Dutch, who sought to reproduce the wax-resist batiks made in Indonesia as factory-produced textiles. Though rejected by the Indonesian market, the textiles were readily embraced by West African patrons who reappropriated the designs as their own by investing them with new meanings. A profitable market emerged and expanded as factories first in the Netherlands and England, and then later in Africa, and most recently China, began producing textiles entirely for African consumers and with designs reflecting African tastes and sensibilities. Shonibare purchases the cloth from London's Brixton Market, an act that in itself underscores the fact that, as he puts it, the fabrics are not really authentically African the way people think. they prove to have a crossbred cultural background quite of their own. It's the fallacy of that signification that I like. Within the sea of riotous patterns selected for this installation, Shonabari has inserted some provocatively humorous elements. A tartan design is a nod to the Ballantyne's Scottish heritage, and the servant bearing the fancy peacock as the main course sports a jacket with a pattern featuring a tuna can being opened. The presumed host and hostess are decked out in fabric commemorating the 50th anniversary of Ghanaian independence, a sly reference to the emergence of post-colonial nations in Africa. Though the fabrics might signify an exotic African otherness, they point to the constructed nature of cultural identity, shaped by entangled histories and the global flows of people and ideas. Beyond issues of race and cultural identity, Party Time offers a pointed commentary on the economic and social divisions of Gilded Age America. But here again, Shonabari embraces nuance. For while Party Time offers critique, it also acknowledges, even encourages complicity. The installation seduces with opulence, inviting visitors to indulge and take pleasure in its decadence. Once captivated visually, they might delve more deeply into the work, gaining awareness that such excess is dependent on others, and also perhaps of their own complicity in participating. Yet again, the artist resists easy moralizing, implying that he himself would indulge in luxury if given the chance. Quote, "I also desire excess. I desire wealth," he has stated. "I don't necessarily feel I want to exploit other people to get these things, but I desire them. As much as critiquing the establishment, I am also indulging, and I do not take a clear moral ground that I do not want some of these luxuries myself." End quote. In taking a seat at this table, Shonibare manifests his presence within a history from which he has been erased, and at the same time, unapologetically claims pleasurable consumption as a right, not a privilege. Quote, "I don't believe for one moment that one's Blackness should mean that one should always be on the margins of society or suffering in some way," he says. "This is an important political stance in my practice." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christa. And even though I've read the essay, I feel like I find something new each time I reread it and really focus on particular passages. And I know that you'd asked me to be in conversation with you as someone who is actually very familiar with the Newark Museum, not as a staff member, but as someone who at a very early age attended the Newark Museum quite frequently. Some of you know that I'm from Newark. I don't make any, I always make sure people know I'm from Newark, originally true Jersey girl. And I have often publicly credited the Newark Museum for my career as an art historian because I was fascinated, absolutely fascinated by what a museum could offer. And I don't think I really went to any other museums because the Newark Museum was located downtown. My preschool was very close by there. The YMCA was there. I used to take swim lessons there. And so it was really a part and parcel of the community. And with that said, I found the Ballantyne House very, very intriguing as a child. And I should mention too, we went to the Newark Museum because it was free. And so you know, the Newark Museum was this sort of wonderful, in my head, kind of like an amusement park, because it wasn't just a fine arts museum. They had live animals. They had jazz concerts in the courtyard. And then, of course, they had the Ballantine House, and for which I had recurring surreal dreams, sometimes nightmares, but also just kind of surreal because I didn't understand the place, but I knew I was attracted to it. And so this, when I actually winded up taking my children, my parents still live in Newark, and as does my brother, and I wind up taking my kids to this installation, and trying to describe to them. I remember even relaying to my husband that at the moment, I was like, you don't understand. I haven't been to this place since I was a kid. Maybe I'd gone as an adult once or twice, but I only really remember the experience of being there. And there's something about these 19th century, early 20th century period houses and rooms that are quite opulent and stately. And because the Ballantine House existed in Newark, I was born in Newark in the 70s and spent most of my elementary school experience in the 80s. And it was a you know, we were going through some things. It was the height of the crack epidemic. It was in the AIDS epidemic soon after or before. And but it was still such a great home and community where people knew each other. So the Ballantine House was like nothing else I'd seen. Just there's no reference point to when you're growing up in a 2-bedroom apartment to access what you're seeing. So for me, it was always sort of this big flashy place that, you know, kind of along the lines of what Yinka describes as, you know, I kind of want a little bit of that excess. I didn't know why I was attracted. I didn't understand all of the intricacies the way I know now. So I'm curious for you, I'm actually going to ask you about what was your first experience in that space, because they, you know, I love that you give this rundown of how the museum responded to, you know, this, dare I say, accusation by this teacher of not seeing a reason to bring her mostly poor, mostly minority students into a grand house that was built for long dead, rich white people.
Right.
Yeah. So what was your, when you initially saw that space and you saw it already reinstalled? Yes.
Yes. The first time, I first saw it after, you know, you had seen it. I first saw it in the 1990s after the House and Home reinstallation. And it was shortly after I had moved to New Jersey myself and was actually applying for a position at the Newark Museum and had never been to the museum. And, you know, part of my reaction to the Ballantine House was similar to yours, Nikki. And I brought my kids there as, you know, when they were toddlers too. And, you know, everybody's always kind of the drama of it. You kind of, for those of you who haven't been at the museum, you don't enter through the front door, but you enter through these small decorative arts galleries. And so all of a sudden it opens up and it's this very kind of luxurious space and high drama. So I was first struck by the things you describe about just the opulence. But I have to say, when I was, you know, being a curator and being a kind of curator who thinks of, you know, the importance of museum education, when I started to read the interpretation, I was really struck with how progressive it was. Mm-hmm. So I really want to have that history as part of this essay, because House and Home, you know, in addition to kind of giving visibility to these historically invisible stories, these stories that existed but aren't often represented in museums, the team at Newark took on issues of class and taste that aren't often discussed in museums. You know, how tastes change, you know, how class intersects with luxurious objects. And I think just even changing the collection policy so that you're not always collecting decorative arts that reflects the taste of, the uber elite, which is almost always defined as white and wealthy. So the intersectionality, which wasn't a term, I don't think, back in the mid 90s, maybe it was something that really appealed to me in the interpretation. And so I was really thrilled when, Yinka agreed to work in this space as part of the centennial celebration.
Yeah. And it's interesting to reflect back, again, for me to reflect back to that space and not understanding how much a place like the Ballantine House can imprint on you. And I'm curious about the kind of reactions you received from folks who did show up for this the reinstallation, including Yinka Shonibare CBE's work, because there is something so captivating about the way in which those fabrics work within that space, the way the positions of all of the figures, and it really does, at least for me, it shows up as this kind of poking fun at a kind of conversation, a tension between what he wants to say about the ridiculousness of it, of that kind of over the top wealth that the beer business brought to the Ballantines, who were Scottish, and in the face of having immigrant communities from Germany and Italy and other places make their home in Newark alongside African Americans, that there's all of these sort of social economic forces at play.
Yeah.
And he gets right at it.
He does. And I think the audience reaction, the Newark Museum, I think, certainly in the years that I was there, has, I would not say, I'm sure there's always room for improvement. There was always room for improvement, but they were not late to the game in attracting an authentically diverse audience. And so the audience was a diverse audience. And when the show first opened, when the installation first opened, we were actually recording a podcast. Yinka was on site, and we were recording a podcast with Yinka and myself and Ulysses Dietz, who was the co-curator of this, who gave, kind of history on the decorative arts. And but we started to hear people's reactions, and the people who were filming the podcast ultimately incorporated that into the podcast. And for people who are interested, you can Google Newark Museum and Party Time in Yinka, and it's on YouTube. You can see it. But so you have, kids saying things like, "Oh, I think they might be naughty. They look very naughty," and I love that, people had this reaction. They were laughing. They were kind of curious. A lot of the audience and a lot of the staff I worked with at every level of the museum, from the top to the attendants, were from West Africa. And so the cloth itself, I think resonated because it's, has such a strong presence in Newark. So it was really, that audience reaction ended up being a part that we really kind of drew into this podcast. And I think every time the Newark Museum has shown this work, people, they might not get it at first glance at the level that you and I, Nikki, would discuss it as art historians. But, there's aspects to this project that, they get the sense of displacement, they get the sense of humor. I think there is a feeling of welcome and disruption. There's a kind of, there is the kind of luxury being built on the labor of others, but there is also, as Yinka says, this kind of you kind of makes you want to crave that luxury.
Absolutely. And I know that in the context of the arts community and as a whole in Newark, that the changing demographics of the city itself and the economic influx over the last 20, 25 years where there's a growing number of organizations and people, Rutgers University, of course, and Express Newark downtown, where you really get a sense by the time this is installed that well, Express Newark wasn't open yet, but there's a sense that Newark really was and continues to be a center for a thriving art community. And one of the conversations we had previously was the fact that the Newark Museum opens in 1909, and this is concurrent with New York and the Boston MFA and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the place of Newark as at the intersection of these places where most people, I think, maybe even still today, don't know how powerful that art community has been and continues to be. And I guess I mentioned that because there's something to it that, you know, it's not just, I'm not the only one who's growing up going to the Newark Museum. The Newark Museum is a place where you go for your field trips, right? And so in Newark, the education department was certainly in the 80s even very well known for their education program. How do you think the way in which Yinka, as a Black British artist, coming in to a very specific kind of city, how do you think that his own experiences as a Black British artist who grew up partially in Nigeria informs the way in which he can read? And I think it serves as a read of the Ballantine House. And I think in some respects, the art community, the art with the big A community.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think Yinka is, I think I'm always struck by this story he tells about, he's somebody he happened to be born in London because I think his father was going to law school at the time, but he was raised in Lagos, Nigeria. And so when he returned to London to go to art school, like he describes being struck by the fact, like it just, where he grew up in Lagos, he was from a very privileged environment. When he got to London and started having, more racist experiences, he was really struck by the fact, like, what I'm supposed to be lesser, that makes no sense. It just, so his experience is very different, I think. I think the Black British experience is different in many ways than the African-American experience. And so in a way he was, I think, an outsider in some ways to this history that he was engaging with at Newark, and sensitive to the different trajectories of Black people in the United States. I found it interesting. I mean, he really was engaging more within, the historic African-American presence in Newark. And as a curator of African art who had spent a lot of time at Newark working with West African first and second generation communities in some of my projects, I found that interesting because there's this complication of Blackness in Newark's demographics, and Yinka kind of was centered on the African American as opposed to what Chimamanda Adichie would call the American African. So yeah, I think it is a particular take, and and he was thinking about the Bernie Madoff scandal and things that were happening in the United States at that time. So I think it's it was a complicated project.
Right. And to that point of the demographics of Newark, it certainly is the case that it is a prominent city with both generations of African Americans, and it is also we I haven't lived permanently in Newark in many years, but it's still my city.
Yeah.
But there's also a large populations, as you mentioned, from places like Nigeria and Ghana, as well as Haiti, and throughout the Caribbean, Brazil, Portugal, right? And
Yep.
so it's an interesting understanding of that transnational view, that and I should note that when you write African print, you put that in quotations, right? It's African print by way of Indonesia, Britain, now more so, more popularly China and Korea and other places. So that's also very much embedded in some of that display of this grouping of party time, and yes, during a recession, or really kind of close to a recovery from the recession.
Yeah, it was directly influenced by the recession, and just thinking about this continuing, the haves and the have-nots, and these discrepancies of wealth. And I'll also, just to add also that in terms of the museum context, that it was from my perspective as a curator, it was part of this, work I had been trying to do with the African collection to, extend its range to modern and contemporary, but also to complicate the notion of, African art in, quotation marks, air quotes. And, we eventually ended up renaming the department the Arts of Global Africa, to, kind of affirm this idea of this continent as being, part of a larger global networks, which, the cloth that Yinka uses, demonstrates, very clearly that the history, the trajectories of those cloths. And to kind of get out of these silos that curatorial departments often exist in. I mean, I think one of the benefits of this project was having it not situated in a gallery that's defined as African art, but in a space that's unexpected, because visitors don't really think in the same kind of terms that museological categories ask them to think in.
I absolutely agree with you, and I think as an institution, the Newark Museum has often been ahead of the curve. I mentioned the education department had already been ahead of the curve in terms of how to implement educational opportunities for its visitors. And again, I'm going to reiterate access, and having an intentionality involved with how do you, especially now as we've as more and more cases of museums sort of flopping in their efforts to diversify and find equity and inclusion, that these become terms by which many institutions feel like if they are almost like if they say it enough and
it's going to happen.
It's going to happen, or all you need to do is hire one Black
right
curator, and you've changed the institution.
Of course,
can be very harmful, right? But what I appreciate you kind of outlining in the museum's approach is that you don't get to have the success of Yinka Shonabari's Party Time without the museum already, what was that, 10 years before, over 10 years before, actively changing the narrative, and that insistence that museums must change the narrative, not just through statements and one-off actions, but rather through a change of behavior, of scholarship, of access, and that takes time for it to become a part of the culture that then allows for Yinka Shonabari's work to be installed in such a way that it makes sense. It's not just
Yeah.
out of
No,
nowhere, right?
I think that's a really, I mean, the need for these efforts to be synthetic and woven in throughout every level. And, when you and I were talking the other day in preparation for this, and I was saying that, even when I had reread this essay after writing it, several months ago, the fact that when Newark did the reinstallation, that their target audience was defined as non-white, in their 30s and 40s with children. And, you and I were talking about, the recent incident at Newfields, which, had this job posting defining its, core white audience. And, this is the kind of thing that needs to be done to kind of have the planning, from the get-go, define your audience in new ways.
Yes.
And then have the collecting policy follow and the interpretation follow.
Absolutely. And I think, I know you're no longer at the Newark Museum, and you have been actively writing and working and leading as an independent curator. I'm curious whether, what do you see as some of these obstacles? And I don't want to get too far. Maybe I should get back to the installation itself. But I feel like I mention it because I think your role as a curator at the Newark Museum, and you were responsible for the reinstallation of the global African art at the museum as well. And I'm curious whether you do have some kind of some kind of advice for other curators and institutions who are looking to change, not just have an installation that they think might be cool at the time or hip, or a response to Black Lives Matter.
I think it's really challenging because I think, as you pointed out, Nikki, there's this notion that, you can hire one person or you can put a show up or a series of shows, but it's really changing, the structures within, how even the terminology that we use, even the way we divvy up real estate within a museum. I mean, any curator of African art out there will tell you that we always have the smallest space for, the art of a continent of 54 countries. But, and also the level of the trustees as well, like how diverse are these boards? So, it's really, the curators can do something up to a certain point, but there are these larger, institutional structures, even the way we categorize curatorial departments. And they're aligned, as you know, with art history as a discipline. And it's kind of this, self-replicating circular thing. It's very hard to break out of dominant narratives when these different areas are not, they're not taught in art history programs.
Right.
And it's kind of replicates itself in the museum. So, it's not, I do think we're hopefully moving forward, but
yeah,
it's a long road.
So in terms of, I do want to make sure we talk a little bit about Party Time itself. Tell me, what was sort of the most surprising aspect of the installation for you?
Well, what was the most surprising aspect? It was certainly interesting just to see, because this was Yinka's first project where he actually, his canvas was this historic home, and he's, worked with these period environments, but this is the first time. And actually, the original idea that was discussed was that it was going to be a film. And there is a very, filmic quality to the final project. And he was, as I talk about in my essay, he was very influenced by certain films in capturing the poses of the individuals. So, that was interesting we weren't able to do a film for various complicated logistic reasons and budget as well. But, just the process of kind of conceptualizing it, it was really interesting to meet the larger team. I mean, Yinka is a conceptual artist, and he works with a team of fabricators. So, it was interesting to meet the people behind some of the elements that were being fabricated. One of the stories that I sometimes tell when I talk about this in classes, which I shared with you earlier, was the studio manager. She thought one of her hardest duties was she was assigned to go to the peacock farm. The servant comes bearing this peacock, which I guess was at the time, kind of, fancy dinner. So that sadly was a real peacock. And the studio manager talked about going to visit this farm and waiting till the right moment to, well, the rest is history. But so that was kind of, those kinds of tidbits. And I will say, like, from an inside museum nerd standpoint, the work itself has over 400 individual parts, and the registrars, who's one of their jobs is to kind of assign accession numbers to every part.
Right.
We're not too pleased with that.
Gosh. Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. That gets getting down to some real nitty gritty details.
Yes.
I know I was definitely impressed by the peacock. I think it's one of the, it's the part of the installation that is really over the top. And you actually do a really great formal analysis of how this conversation, this party is so hopping. It's, they're so into each other. They've got their feet kicked up on the table, right? They're drinking, they're having a good time, that they don't even notice.
Nope.
This butler with this amazing real peacock.
With the gilded beak.
With the gilded beak.
Yeah.
Wow.
Gilded age, gilded beak.
It's so fabulous. And I know that so many people, and even people who are on today, they follow your work, or they know Shonabari's work, right? It is so, now we can see more installations. I got to see I forget what it's called, the library that he installs.
Yeah.
Fabrics. I saw that at the ICA Boston, and I know I've seen that in various places. And there's something really just so attractive about the fabrics themselves. And I should say, and I know whenever I teach his work, these people are headless, right?
Yes.
And so I don't want to glaze over that aspect of the work too, that they are so animated and so involved that they are alive, right? The way in which he poses these mannequins, you almost can forget that there are no faces, there are no heads. Right.
I don't even think about, it sometimes takes, somebody commenting on it, and part is the familiarity with the work, but you're right. As an artist, he's so careful, the postures are so carefully conceived. He was really studying for this particular installation. He was studying several of these films, dinner party scenes where he wanted to capture, as you put it, this sense, everybody's so absorbed in these intimate exchanges, that they don't even notice, the main course coming.
Do you know whether he ever has, outside of film, does he ever have sitters, models that actually also sit and don the fabric ahead of putting them on the mannequin? That's just something I'd never actually thought about that until you mentioned.
Yeah, I actually do not know the answer to that question. You mean as like a kind of as a way to kind of work through a project? Yeah,
work project.
Yeah, I don't know if he did that. That's a really good question.
Okay.
Back to the drawing board for my essay.
Maybe not. I love when people give you some ideas like that.
That's a good idea, Nikki. Yeah. We'll have to ask him.
Yeah, that would be that would be interesting, especially if we're thinking about the fact that peacock, right, was alive and moving.
Yeah.
Until it was stopped.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You're on mute, Krishna.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I don't mean to interrupt, but we do have a couple of questions that
Sure.
I'd like to ask you, and then you can always continue. This has been fascinating. We've learned so much. And so one question is, has Shonibari practiced his unsettling art back in Nigeria, for example? Has he taken it outside of the West?
Ah,
Has he shown his work? I think, I mean, he's
Oh, not shown, but created work.
created something. No, I mean, I think, not that I know of. I think it's possible. I know he's creating, I think he's creating a residency program right now. I don't think that that's started, but that's not the same as creating a work that unsettles. But I think I think that'd be a fantastic idea. I mean, Nigeria is so complicated. What a great place to unsettle history in a new platform, but not to my knowledge. But
Thank you. We have another question from Florcy Morissette. She says, thank you. This was a wonderful conversation. In terms of the post-pandemic era, how might we envision leveraging technology to augment and increase access and engagement to this immersive and vivid space?
It's not currently installed, right?
no, it's not currently installed. I mean,
It's a good
yeah,
question overall on access to places during pandemic and how we might.
Right.
yeah. I mean, there's the podcast video that does a nice job, but I mean, it's even when we're not in a pandemic world, it's not always on view. It's only been on view, I think, to my knowledge, 3 times at the Newark Museum. It does displace all the period furniture, but when it has been on view, it's been on view for a good 6 to 9 months. And then it was shown in Chicago recently as well.
As far as you know, there's no video or virtual tour recorded.
There's no virtual tour that I know of, but the podcast, is pretty, it's like it's a 10-minute long podcast where the artist is talking about it, and it kind of, it does a 360 around the work.
Thank you. One last question. Party time is very colorful. Is that part of his disruptive feature, Shonibari's disruptive feature, or is it reflective of or enhancement of the style of the Gilded Age? How does he play with the brightness and the color as he brings in African elements?
Well, I think, in part it's just it's the medium he works with is the Dutch wax fabric, which is inherently very colorful, and has historically been very colorful since its early days of, kind of creation, originally meant to compete with these Indonesian batiks. And I think when he deploys it in his installations, he really he's using it like a palette. I mean, I think he's very conscious of the different designs and how different colors and patterns work together. In terms of the Gilded Age specifically, I think that it does really resonate with that kind of over the top luxury, the kind of color combinations that you see. I mean, if you were to go into the Ballantine house without his installation being there, it feels like this. It feels very opulent. I guess it kind of, to me, pumps it up a level, but in one sense, it's jarring, it's surprising, but on another sense, it's not, because if you walk in that space, there's these beautiful stained glass windows and the light comes through, and you're enveloped by, it's displacing in the sense that you don't expect to see the colorful fabrics, but in terms of like the palette and the overall colorful layered nature of it, it feels of its time in a way, which in part it is. I mean, some of these patterns have been in circulation since 1885 when the Valentine House was built. And that's kind of his point, the outsider is already within.
Right. Perhaps he heightens the outsider is always already in by playing upon these Orientalist expectations of the continent of Africa.
Yeah.
May I squeeze in one last question, please? This is from Debbie Moran. She says, I love this conversation. Old friend Debbie is here with mom. Can you tell us more about the role of Victorian colonialism and imposition of collecting categorization systems, how they affected the whole approach to collections and curatorial approaches, and how the Victorian focus on collecting and excess of exotic cultures,
Right.
how those lenses result in the absence of the collected culture. Party time is a fascinating expression and commentary on this tradition for me.
Well, thank you to my high school friend, Debbie, for asking the easy question. You could write either books written on this topic. I guess I would just say, Nikki, if you want to add to this too, of course, museums were born in the Victorian era. The Newark Museum itself is modeled after the Victoria and Albert Museum. And so, its collecting strategy, its foundational collecting strategy was very much part of that, Victorian desire to classify, but it does have this applied art bent to it, which is the term we use to describe decorative arts. And so that's how a lot of the collections, that's how the African collection even ended up coming in, because of course, in Western museums, objects from Africa were not really considered as fine art until about, the 1920s and 30s. And so there is this, this Victorian interest in applied arts, in the notion of empire, and the notion of collecting material culture from empire to represent and to create hierarchies is definitely part of the mix and part of the interesting early history of Newark as well.
Yeah.
For good and for bad.
Right. And it also reminds me of, this is also so much about fashion, sort of related to the prior question, because if we think about the way that, again, those fabrics show up in that space, it is of its time. It is contemporary to the Valentine House and the grand tours of Europe, and then going on from there. I just taught in my 100 level class about the Dutch Empire and the crisscrossing around the world. And I do want to give just like a little bit of a shout out to a fashion designer named, the company name is Ikari Jones. And was he in their men's fashion?
No, but somebody Adrian and I are thinking of for our project.
Yeah, well, I think he's done a great job with speaking back to a kind of reversal. And those of you who have seen Black Panther, you'll recognize the scarf that what's the character's name? At the end, where he's sort of, they've been victorious and they're talking to the UN. But that scarf and the designs that's created by Carrie Jones takes European designs and replaces the historically white figures, the historically European figures, and imposes Black figures instead. And there's a whole other thing that he does with, he has a series of models too who are refugees in Italy, for example, as that's a very big issue right now in terms of xenophobia, et cetera. But, there's a way that this talking back to the Victorian era at a contemporary point really can be a productive conversation, and one that continue. T'Challa, thank you. Yeah, that you can kind of read back at time, push back at a narrative, again, that kind of changing the narrative in the 21st century, so that what used to be a kind of flex in power, of European power, is no more, and you can kind of have a party right off of that, right?
And just challenging like this notion of like what's a European design, what's an African design. I just remember being struck by seeing these very early examples of the African print cloth that were collected, that were part of the Philadelphia Commercial Museum, which is no longer in existence, were collected in the late 19th century. And they had these amazing patterns of like cut crystal goblets. And these were patterns that were dictated by the West African patrons. So they're not, yes, they're European in the sense that the goblets were made in Europe, but they're just as much African as anything. They're being claimed in a different way. And I think that that's kind of what, Yinka is doing in this project with claiming the space of the Ballantine House.
Right. Wow, there is so much more to say on this topic. There's a whole conversation to take place about appropriation and certainly right now how Black culture, global Black culture, how we can see the imprint throughout the world, but not always with the kind of credit it deserves.
Yep, global Africa.
Global Africa. So, thanks, Christa, for this. This is such a great case study on so many levels: museum studies, fashion, installation. It's just so rich, and of course on Newark history, which I'm especially grateful for. So
thank you, Nikki. Thanks so much for sharing your scholarship and also your personal history and response and experience in this space. And it's always great to talk to you. And thanks, Christa.
What's the book that this essay will appear in?
The book is called Revisiting the Past. I've looked for this title, Revisiting the Past in Museums and Historic Sites. So it's an edited volume published by Routledge next year.
Great.
Wow. We look forward to that.
Yes.
Okay. And on that note, I'd like to read a quick comment by your friend Zetty Evans. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
You got it right.
Okay. Your friend says, "Hi, Christa. I miss our friends at the Newark Museum." And I'm already missing this conversation. I'm already feeling nostalgic. This is so wonderful. Thank you both for engaging us so splendidly this Friday afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. See you soon.
See you soon. Bye.
Hopefully.
Take care.
Bye.
Yes.